Welcome once again to the Upper Room. It's great to be with you. I want to start today by telling you about a guy that you probably have never heard of. You should have heard of him, but his name is Okongo Samson. Okongo was born in Kenya, Africa, and he was the 15th of 16 children. And he was probably born about 5 decades ago. You may realize that in much of Africa, they don't keep real close dates of births. And so, it's kind of vague as to how old he is. Growing up in Kenya, obviously, he probably didn't have a lot of money. He talks about the fact that he and some of his siblings would eat off the same plate oftentimes at mealtime. His father had become a Christian because of some interaction with some missionaries years before Okongo came along. And so Okongo grew up in a Christian home, which was a great thing. And by the time he was 15, he felt like he was hearing from God. Specifically, Okongo was hearing from God that God wanted him to go to the outermost regions of the world to share the gospel of Christ. And so at the young age of 15, he joined up with some other people who got in a van and started driving north to Uganda. Not long after they got into Uganda, they were abducted. They were pulled aside by some radical soldiers that were fighting in a war, and they're pulled out of their van. And from that moment on, it got really scary. As they pulled this group of people out, they then had them stripped naked and they took them into the jungle where they would be abused in every way imaginable and in the process prepared to be sent into war. And as they were told to prepare themselves for battle, Okongo settled in his mind that he would die either in battle or as he tried to run away, because they had shot several of their group who were trying to run away from their captors. And so he began one night to just walk away, and somehow in the middle of the night, expecting to be shot in the back, it didn't happen. He walked 30 miles to the nearest town, and when he came into town, he had no clothes on, and a woman saw him, and she had one of those wraps on her head, and she took her wrap off, put it around him, and took him to the police station. So you have this teenager who shows up at the police station with a woman's wrap around him, and lo and behold, when he got there, he saw the van that they had traveled in to get to Uganda. He quickly went over to the van, looked in there, and all his documents were in there. His passport, identification, and he was able to escape and go back to Kenya, where he was from. Now you'd think that when he got back to Kenya, he would get a hero's welcome, that he had survived such a terrible event in his life. Instead, the church fathers and his own family basically turned on him and said, "What are you thinking? God would never lead you into harm's way. That is not God's way of doing things." And so we find Okongo in an absolute destitute kind of situation where his family and his church elders and fathers had turned on him and said that he was in rebellion for doing something God would never ask anyone to do, and yet he believed he had heard from God. And he really gets to the place where he's depressed, almost to a dangerous state, and we're going to leave Okongo there. Sorry about that, and we'll pick his story up at another time. We're coming to you from just outside the Delta Correctional Facilities. This is a prison. It's kind of a regional prison. And I've been in there, actually. I have spent time talking to... That kind of sounded funny, didn't I? I spent some time in a conversation with a guy who was in there for murder. And what I want to tell you about the people in this correctional institution is that they are behind those gates and those walls and those barbed wired fences because at some level they disturbed the peace. Now you may say, "Steve, I think if they're in there for murder, they did more than disturb the peace." When we think of disturbing the peace, we think of someone who has played their music too loud, or they have 100 dogs that are out of control in their yard. But the truth of the matter is, if you think about disturbing the peace, any violation of somebody else's freedom or sense of tranquility is disturbing the peace, which included in that has to be stealing from somebody, murdering somebody, whatever, fighting with somebody. that truly is disturbing the peace. And so we come to you because whatever the magnitude of the crime of the folks that live behind me have committed, at its most basic level, it was about disturbing the peace. So disturbing the peace comes in many different forms and fashions, doesn't it? I mean, for the most part, we think of disturbing the peace as something very benign, but what do wars do? The war in Ukraine right now, it's disturbing the peace of the people who live there. So at one level or another, disturbing the peace is an infraction of people's freedom and their free will, actually. So I want to give you this discussion question right off the bat, and that is, describe a time when somebody disturbed your peace. Okay, and it'll be interesting to see the level of infraction that you come up with. Have a great discussion. I think I've told you before about when I was in high school, and even before that, there were a couple times in junior high, middle school they call it now, where my peace was disturbed. A kid by the name of Tony Barrientos in, I think it was wood class. Can you believe I took wood class and it's had no effect on my life? I have no idea what to do with wood other than burn it. Anyway, Tony Barrientos, in this moment of I don't know what, pulled a knife on me and literally held it up to my neck. I hadn't done anything. I guess he just didn't like the way I looked. In that moment, Tony Barrientos disturbed my peace. Then in high school, Roy DePoe, I think I told you about Roy. He stood about 5'2". He was shaving by the time he was in 5th grade. And he didn't like my dad because my dad was the principal of the high school. He had it in for him. He couldn't go after my dad, of course, so he came after me. I was just peacefully playing some water basketball in the swimming pool at the high school during PE when all of a sudden someone grabbed my ankles and turned me upside down and held me underwater. I was afraid I was going to drown, so I kicked my way out of it. And when I came up, it was Roy DePoe, no taller than me. But again, he'd been a man for many years by the time we were in high school, and he wanted to fight. He wanted to fight because I had kicked him. Well, why had I kicked him? Because he was drowning me. So he said, I'll meet you after school and we'll fight. Roy DePoe, Tony Barrientos, people like that disturb the peace of your life. It's amazing how we can have peace for a time in our lives, right? But it seems like there's always something or someone that disturbs our peace. Historians of the United States say that there were only 2 periods of peace for our country, and they both happened in the 1800s, each of them for about 30 years. That in the entire history of our country, only those 2 short periods were periods of absolute peace. Since 1945, 70 wars have broken out in our world, and there have been over 200 incidents of international conflict that might not even be seen as wars. And so peace is a very difficult commodity to come by. I think you'll agree. And yet we come now in our series, The Lucky Ones, to a time when Jesus says in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." So Matthew chapter 5 verse 9 is actually the 7th beatitude. So the groundwork has been laid, and once we have a pure heart and we have the other things that Jesus talked about the kingdom of God, we now know that we are called to being peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. If we are children of God, it's what we do. It's who we are. So if we're going to talk about peace, we have to obviously talk about conflict. Again, the people in the facility behind me at some point had an awful lot of conflict. They caused conflict in people's lives. Conflict usually is dealt with in one of 2 ways. It's dealt with by ignoring it. Okay, we call that sweeping it under the rug. Some families will say there's an elephant in the living room, and that is there's something that nobody wants to talk about that's a source of conflict, so we're just not going to talk about it. The second way is we suppress it. We intimidate people. We force people to just keep their mouth quiet, and it's not just ignoring it. It's actually, I'm going to destroy your peace in case you want to destroy my peace. Because the idea of you raising conflict is something I'm not going to live with. The reality is, even those of us who call ourselves children of God tend to lean towards at least the first one. I know more people than I can imagine that would rather ignore conflict than ever deal with it. But if we're going to call ourselves children of God, according to Jesus, being a peacemaker, dealing with conflict is something we do. It's who we are. Now, as we get into it, I want to tell you I have this premise, and the premise is this, that most of us would rather talk about, think about, worry about, even pray about conflict on a huge scale, right? This war in Ukraine that's going on right now, oh, people are wearing their lapel pins and they're showing their Ukrainian flag support and everything. And if history shows us anything in our country, people would rather protest about conflict than actually resolve conflict. I think, going back to the Vietnam War, that's when I first became aware of it, that protesting against war makes people feel good. It makes me feel like I've done something, you know? But in reality, if all I did was walk down the street in downtown and hold up a sign that says, "Stop the war," if that's all I'm doing, have I really done anything to resolve any conflict? But that's okay. That's beside the point. What I've done is I feel better about myself. I've done my part. So here's my premise. We would rather do that than deal with the real conflict in our lives that we actually have some influence over. All right? Holding up a sign with the Ukrainian flag does not stop what's going on in Ukraine. However, there is conflict in each of our lives with family members, neighbors, co-workers. There is conflict. Marriage, need I say? There is conflict that we could actually have an influence over. That's more difficult, so we won't do that. We'll just feel good about holding up a sign. That's my premise. So here's my encouragement today. Let's go local. Let's go local. There's nothing wrong with praying for the Ukrainian people. Absolutely nothing. Or nor praying for the people in Somalia and all the places around the world where conflict rages. Nothing wrong with that. But if you really want to make a personal influence, begin with the local conflict in your life instead of ignoring it or trying to suppress it. And so that's where we begin. I'm going to give you some ideas about how we can become better at being peacemakers since we're children of God. And again, before we get into it, I want to just mention the fact that, again, oftentimes we think that all conflict comes because of sin. And we're definitely going to mention that more and talk about it because most conflict does come as a result of sin. However, there's an awful lot of conflict that comes just because of our differences. So let's make that bridge. It's not a bridge too far to say that some of our conflict that we deal with that keeps us from being peacemakers is simply because we have differences. Discussion question once again. So what do you think you can do to deal with the differences between you and other people in your life? What could be done to deal with those things? Because those differences often result in conflict that's unnecessary. I want to go to Acts chapter 15 real quick because in Acts chapter 15, Paul and Barnabas have come off their first missionary journey and they're getting ready to go on another missionary journey. I'm going to read to you from verse 36. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let's go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, by the way, is a cousin of his. He says, "I want to take John called Mark with him," but Paul did not think it was wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued on with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. Okay, a great example of conflict, a sharp disagreement. That is the nicest way to say they went at it. I mean, I don't know if it came to fisticuffs, but they went at it at least verbally because Barnabas says John Mark was young, he deserves another chance. Paul says, no, he abandoned us, we're not taking that quitter with us. And so you say, wow, that's kind of embarrassing for the kingdom. Well, what that is it's a reality that the kingdom is filled with people who are humans and see life differently. And I'm guessing you could give a few examples in your marriage of how you see life differently. Well, Paul and Barnabas saw life very differently. Here's the great news. Number one, instead of one missionary team, now God had two missionary teams. And you'll also notice that in 2 Timothy chapter 4, as Paul is near the end of his life, this is the last letter he'll write, and he's writing to Timothy, who is living in Ephesus, and he says, send John Mark with you because he is so helpful. Now, why would he say that? If you go back to Colossians, you read that John Mark had become a partner with Paul in ministry. What had happened? In time, those differences had been resolved. That's a picture of how we as children of God become peacemakers. We deal with our differences. For a time, it may divide us, but ultimately, we realize that we are partners in the gospel. Isn't that a great story about Paul and John Mark? Oh, by the way, what did that do for John Mark? Yeah, he's the one that wrote the Gospel of Mark. And would that have ever happened had there not been that resolution? It's also said that John Mark went to Alexandria, Egypt, and started the church there. So great story that came out of differences. So that instance between Barnabas and Paul and John Mark, it turned out to be such a great story. If you know the end of it, right? In the midst of it, you go, oh, kind of cringeworthy, right? Can't these really mature disciples of Jesus get along? But in the end, through the journey, things get resolved, and that's the picture of peacemakers. So here we go. Let's jump into some of the elements. I'm going to give you 5 elements of the peacemaker journey that you and I are on as children of God. And the first one is a review, actually, of something we talked about maybe a year ago, and that is that we make it our priority. The fact that being a peacemaker is a priority is answering the question, when? When should we do the peacemaking? I take you back to Matthew chapter 5. We'll actually come to this here in another few weeks, but let's just read the passage. Verse 23, Jesus says, so if you are presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice there at the altar. Go and be reconciled to that person. Then come and offer your sacrifice to God. In other words, Jesus says, the horizontal does impact the vertical. We think that we can keep them separate. I'm good with God just because I can't get along with people. Jesus says, I'll tell you what, they are attached. If you're not getting along with somebody, leave the act of worship to go and do an act of worship, and that is go make it right with somebody. So the sacrifice for the Jewish people was really the most important moment of their worship, and Jesus says, yeah, that's really important, but let me tell you, when do you resolve conflict? Now. That's the priority. I'm going to take you on to verse 25 of chapter 5, and Jesus continues on this idea of dealing with conflict. And unfortunately for most of us, especially those of us who don't like to deal with conflict, Jesus talked an awful lot about it. Look at verse 25. When you're on the way to court with your adversary, conflict, settle your differences quickly. Otherwise, your accuser may hand you over to the judge, who will hand you over to an officer, and you'll be thrown into prison. And if that happens, you surely won't be free again until you have paid the last penny. Okay, what is Jesus teaching on? What is he saying? Let me give you some options. Option A, and I can't be there with you in your living room watching this, so just raise your hand when I get to the option you think Jesus is talking about. Option A is he's teaching on litigation 101. Could be, possibly. Option B is that he's saying to avoid prison at all costs because bad things happen there. Some folks behind me might agree. Option C, justice moves swiftly, so must we if we're to avoid prison time. Okay, maybe Jesus is talking about that. Option D, the context is conflict, which we are to deal with quickly and wisely if we're to live peacefully. In other words, there's to be no delay. So the question of, so when do we become peacemakers? Immediately. When we realize there's conflict of any kind with somebody in our relational realm, deal with it quickly. Not only is it a priority, but when it comes to being a peacemaker, it's our process. And again, Jesus answers the question, how now? How do we deal with this? He's so practical when it comes to dealing with conflict. You can tell it's a big deal to Jesus, and should be a bigger deal to us. I take you to Matthew chapter 18, verse 15. Again, this is a review. We've mentioned this before, but I just honestly don't know many people who deal with conflict. So maybe we need to review it every week. Here we go. Matthew chapter 18, verse 15. If another believer sins against you, so now he's not just talking about differences. He's talking about somebody who offends you, who actually does something to you. Go privately and point out the offense. All right? If the other person listens and confesses it, you've won that person back. But if you're unsuccessful, there's a chance they won't listen. Have you ever found that to be true? If you are unsuccessful, take one or two others with you and go back again, so that everything you say may be confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. Okay, this is just wise. You know, we tried to deal with it one-on-one, but it didn't work, so now let's bring 2 people in who are objective, help us work through it. If the person still refuses to listen, take your case to the church. Then if he or she won't accept the church's decision, treat that person as a pagan or a corrupt tax collector. Wow, is that complicated? That's why we don't deal with conflict. And there's like 100 steps there. 4 steps. 4 steps. This excuse that it's too hard. Jesus gives us 4 steps. Someone offends you, go to him personally, privately. Doesn't it work? Take 2 or 3 people with you to help you objectively work through it. If that doesn't work, the 3rd step is bring them before the church. We've talked about this. This is why mega churches don't work, because if you brought people who sinned against one another before a mega church, that's all you would ever be doing. And then you're going to get sued. The 4th step, again, let me go back to the size of the church matters. I believe that when you're in a church of 15 to 25 people, now you bring them before the church. You're talking about people who know them. They have relationships with one another, so this can be resolved. But let's say, Jesus says, even when you bring them before the small community of followers of Jesus and it's not resolved, he says the 4th step is then you put them out. Then you say, we can't have anything to do with you. Why? Why? To punish them? No. Just to raise the value of relationships and community. And to say, if you want to be a part of this community, this is how we deal with conflict. Because dealing with conflict and differences and offenses is not negotiable in the kingdom of God. Let's talk a little bit more about that 4th step. Okay, that 4th step of put them out of the fellowship. Romans chapter 12, verse 17. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. So this process is to be done in an honorable way. Verse 18, do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Do everything possible to be in peace with everyone. Dear friends, never take revenge. Leave that to the righteous anger of God. All right. Try to live in peace with everyone. Don't take revenge. Great story about 2 hefty guys that showed up at this woman's house to do her flooring in her kitchen. She had asked for it to be done, and they show up to do the work. They move the appliances out. They put in the new flooring. She goes, shopping, comes home, and they're pretty much done with the flooring. And so they're getting their tools and getting ready to leave. And she says, could you put the appliances back for me before you leave? And they said, oh, that's not in our contract. We'll do it, but it'll cost you $50. And the woman is just like beside herself. Okay, $50 to move something back that you moved. Okay, she paid them. So they moved it back and they left and said goodbye. Within a minute, there was a knock on the door, and these 2 burly guys were there at the door, and they said, ma'am, we need you to move your car. It's parked behind our van. And she says, that'll be $50. I love that story. It's really easy for us to get into a tit-for-tat revenge kind of thing, but Paul writes the same thing Jesus said, and that is, do all that you can possibly do to live in peace with one another. Now, what is said in that's kind of unsaid is that there are times, there are moments with people, certain situations where you've done all you can possibly do, and there's just not going to be peace. That's a reality. You can do everything right. But the question is, have you done those steps? Have you done it immediately? Have you gone through that process Jesus outlined? And it's still, there's no reconciliation. In those moments, we realize that's part of life. Kind of like Paul and Barnabas. They parted ways. In time, it was resolved. Will your lack of peace with other people be resolved in time? It may be. and it may never be on this side of heaven. In fact, I want to read a passage from Matthew 10, verse 34, that Jesus says something that you may think, well, this is totally different than everything else he said. He said, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." Blessed are the peacemakers, but Jesus came bringing a sword. What he's doing is he's saying the reality is that when I bring life and I bring truth, there will be people who will not accept it. And so there will be a division. And there is a division between light and dark, good and evil. We know that to be true. So Jesus said, it's not just that because I landed on this earth, everybody has peace. Not the case. In fact, war will sometimes rage because I have shown the light and the darkness doesn't like it. So really important to understand, if you've done all you can possibly do, and there's still no resolution, there's still conflict, it's time to part ways, and it's time to say, sometimes that happens. Hopefully someday it'll be resolved. Another aspect of being a peacemaker is the idea that we have a prince who is the Prince of Peace. This answers the question, why? Why would we do this? Because Jesus, from the very beginning, before Jesus even showed up in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, it says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of," you got it, peace. His government and its peace will never end. His government, his kingdom will never end, and it's a kingdom of peace. That's not this government. That's not this world. Make sure you understand. He is the Prince of Peace. This is why we are peacemakers, because we identify with the Prince of Peace. He is our advocate. He is our closest friend. And so because he is the Prince of Peace, it is what we do. It's just what we do. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14. "For he himself is our peace." If you're struggling to find peace, my guess is you're looking everywhere but Jesus. Jesus brings peace to those who invite him in, who turn their lives over to him. There's a sense of peace that if you do not have, you got to go back to the starting block and say, have I handed everything over to him? Because he is our peace. That verse goes on to say, he has made the two groups, the Jews and the Gentiles, who are very different groups, separated, divided. He has made them one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two. Jews and Gentiles was how the world was broken up into two parts. They had hostility towards one another, a dividing wall, and the cross of Christ, as you're about to see, built a bridge between those two groups of people, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came being the peace treaty between groups of people. He came and preached peace to you who were far away and peace to those who were near. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Whether we are far from God or we are close to God, he comes bringing peace, and that's the only way we'll have a bridge between us. Now, our fourth kind of element of being peacemakers is our persona. Okay? The person of Jesus is the one that brings it. He is why we pursue being peacemakers. And then it becomes our persona, which again is beyond even the why, it's the who. It's who we are now in Christ. As God's children, this beatitude says, what Jesus said here, as God's children, it's what we do. We are peacemakers. And so if I'm struggling to be a peacemaker in relationships, I've got to ask myself the question, am I really a child of God? Because it's what we do. It's who we are. John chapter 14, verse 27 from the upper room. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. Jesus says, it's what I do. I give you peace that the world can't offer. And that's our problem, is we look to the world to give us peace, and it absolutely cannot. The world cannot do that. Quit looking to the circumstances of your life. I've got to stop looking for the circumstances of my life to all line up so I can have some peace. Romans 5:1. Therefore, since we have been made right in God's sight by faith, we have peace with God. because of what Jesus Christ our Lord has done for us. It's who we are. It's what we do. Again, Matthew 5:9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they are children of God. It's just who we are. And if you're not at that place where you say, yeah, being a peace broker, as far as it is possible, it's just what I do. As it's my persona, as I'm connected to the person of peace, the person of Christ. The final kind of aspect of being a peacemaker then is our power. Now this sounds kind of crazy. This answers the question, what then comes? And you might think, power, that's the opposite of what Jesus told us to seek, right? In fact, Max Lucado puts it this way, the quest for power is childish. If our desire is to be in control of others and to have power over other people, that's a childish approach to life. So what is this power? You know, power is usually associated with wealth or weapons and control of others, but there is a power that is not like that. That's the world's power. I want to take you to the book of James. James chapter 3, verse 17. But the wisdom from above, there is a wisdom. There is an understanding of life that comes from above. It is first all pure. It is also peace-loving. If you live with the wisdom of Christ, you are peace-loving. It is also gentle at all times. See, not trying to coerce others, control others, harm others, and willing to yield to others. It's submissive. This kind of and you can see it is a power, but it's a different kind of power. It's founded in wisdom. It is willing to yield to others. It is full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. It shows no favoritism and is always sincere. This wisdom is sincere. It's not fake. It's not a facade. Verse 18, and those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of righteousness. It's interesting that in James 3, as I read, that chapter concludes there, and then immediately in James 4, he begins with conflict. So he says, you need wisdom, which will bring peace, and then you'll need to apply that to conflict. And then he talks about the source of conflict. This is a big deal. Let me read to you again what James said. Now, James, I'm sure, had been around farmers, and he understood the idea of a seed. He says, and those who are peacemakers. So he's talking about the people that Jesus said are his children. So he's talking about us. Those of us who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of righteousness. What's the deal with the seed? You know what the deal is. It's planting time around here. Here in another 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to plant some seeds in our garden. That little itty bitty organic material that is dropped into a mound, which to it is like a mountain of dirt, just sinks down in there. It's covered up. And then with some water, some care, some sunlight eventually, that little seed grows and it moves mountains. Seeds move mountains, don't they? It moves a mountain of dirt. That's what he's saying. Sow a seed of peace. Peace has the power to move mountains. Isn't that brilliant by James, the brother of Jesus, to say that, reflecting probably on things that he heard in Jesus' ministry and after Jesus had ascended? Plant the seeds, not because it's spring, but because there's always an opportunity to deal with conflict in this world because there's sin in this world. Plant seeds of peace and you will yield a harvest of righteousness, of being right with God, which takes us back to another beatitude of being right with God, something we hunger and thirst for. This is what children of God do. It's just who we are. Never underestimate the power of a seed, and especially the seed of peace. I take you back one more time, Matthew 5:9. How fortunate are you when you realize that it's the peacemakers who are my children. It's who we are. It's what we do. Let me ask you, is there any greater title that you could aspire to than to be a child of God? Really? I mean, you can be a millionaire, you can be a boss, you can be a lot of things in this world, but they're all temporary. Being a child of God is an eternal badge we wear, and something that peacemakers understand. And so we left Okongo in a place of desperation and despair. His own family, his own church fathers had turned on him, told him he's not hearing from God. I want to fast forward now to the present day. Okongo lives in Tucson. Now, how did he get from Kenya to Tucson? It's quite a journey. In fact, I'll give the link to a YouTube where he describes his journey, and it's worth watching. I'll give that to your leaders, but I want to give you just the overall version of it. He still believed at age 16 that he was being spoken to by God, that he was to go to the uttermost regions of the world, to every place, and share the gospel of Jesus. And specifically, he believed God was saying, go to the countries that don't welcome the message of Jesus. He went to 34 different countries. Most, if not all those countries were antagonistic, opposing the gospel of Jesus, actually having made it illegal, but he went anyway. 34 countries. In 15 of those countries, Okongo was put in prison. He wasn't just put in prison, he was tortured in every way possible. I don't even want to go into the details. You can get his book, you can listen to him on YouTube. You can't even fathom the way in these 15 countries he was tortured. Why? Because he broke the law of sharing the message of Jesus. Let me give you just one example of how Okongo dealt with being imprisoned and tortured. He believed after he had visited those countries, he was actually talking to a guy who challenged him. God used this man to challenge him and said, you know, it sounds to me like you want more than anything peace. Why don't you go back to those 15 countries and make peace with those people? Now, you and I, first of all, would never find ourselves in those countries. Second of all, we would never go back there. We'd say, what have I done? What a mistake that was. Kind of like his church fathers had told him. You know what Okongo did? He went back to those 15 countries and he found the places where he was imprisoned and the people who did it to him and abused him. One of those countries was Yemen. In Yemen, as was the case in the other 14 countries where he had been imprisoned, he had been deprived of food and water. He'd been electrocuted, hung upside down, and yes, sexually abused. And so he came back to Yemen to meet these people. And I want to quote what he says they said to him when he approached them. And here's what they said. Your friends have made us aware of your agenda of living at peace with everyone. And we accept that. But you can't break the law. Well, that's kind of a scary moment. He might go right back into prison, right? And then he said he saw them gather together. I don't know how many there were, and they talked. And then their demeanor softened, and they began to talk in more friendly terms. And Okongo said this, then I realized the things were going to get better, and allowed myself to hope once more. One of the leaders of the group turned to him and said, we are glad you came with your friend. He was speaking of Ibrahim, the man for whom he had cast the demon out of his son and prayed for him. He was with him. And so they're saying, we're glad you came with him. You are welcomed here and you are one of us. These are people who had every intention of killing him. He went on to say, instantly I was at peace and knew the trouble had passed. That night I was at peace and I recalled Paul's words in 2 Thessalonians 3:16. And now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times and in every way. The Lord be with you all. Okongo learned that he could make peace with his past, he could make peace in his present, and he could make peace with his perpetrators. What a message. So have you made peace with your past? Many of us have struggled to do that. Have you made peace with the present, the circumstances right now that alarm you, that unnerve you? And have you made peace with the perpetrators in your life? Those people who have held a knife to your throat, who have tried to drown you? Have you made peace with those people? As far as it is possible, that's what it means to be a child of God. It's what we do. It's who we are. So over a year ago, I was visiting a man in this facility, as I said, who had committed murder several years ago. I've got great news for you. He had peace as much as anybody I've ever met. He had made peace with Christ. He had asked forgiveness. He had done all that had been asked of him. I don't know where he is now. I don't think he's here anymore. But I was kind of amazed that I was in this place where there's little peace, and yet I was talking with a man who had incredible peace, only possible through the cross of Jesus, and those were his words. Thanks for joining us. It's so good to have you. How fortunate are we that the Son of God has told us what life in his kingdom looks like, and as children of God, how we live. It's who we are. It's what we do. God bless.